All right, welcome back. Let's take a look at the remaining components when it comes to thinking about the general vSphere security recommendations as they relate to network, the management network, ESXi hosts, and virtual machines and their guest OSs. So what do we have to be mindful of? Again, remember what we're looking at here are the general guidelines, which are then provided in a far greater detail in the vSphere security guide, which was provided as one of the first links at the start of this lesson. But things that be mindful of, right? The management network basically is the security, physical separations from the rest of your environment, and is something that should be configured with some special characteristics, right? For instance, that network, the management network, should not be something that is generally accessible from any other services in the environment. You should have that management network to be separated off. You might even have a consideration of having a jump box to get from your client system over to that network before you gain access to a vCenter system. You can balance firewall usage against VM performance, but securing that physical switch on each and every host prevents attackers from gaining access to the host and to its VM. So, in your physical switch ports, just ensuring that those switch ports have been secured specifically for the management network. And secure your standard switch ports and the distributed switch ports with security policies. So keep that in mind when it comes to both a standard switch and a distributed switch. Those security policies are things like promiscuous mode, the MAC address changes, and forged transmits. With a distributed switch, those are all set to reject already. So they're already on their security settings on a distributed switch, but on a standard switch, only the promiscuous mode is rejected by default. The MAC address changes and the forged transmits are actually accepted by default. And it is a recommendation. It's actually one of the unusual cases where the recommendation is not the default. The recommendation is to set them all to reject. And you can use physically isolated networks, which is always good. That keeps the best level of isolation, but sometimes that's not possible. So if that's not, then go ahead and use VLANs, the management network, to be on its own VLAN, for instance. Now, for the hosts, right? To secure your hosts, VMware constrains the vSphere parameters and policies. Consider these guidelines for maintaining host security. And we've covered some of these already. Manage access to the ESXi host, right? Avoid using the root user account. What you don't want to have is a shared root account where too many admins know the same root user password. First of all, you don't have an auditing capability. You don't know who did what. Everybody just logs in as root, but then ends up finding that if too many people know this one password, then that password no longer is a secret, and it can now be something that more people that shouldn't have that password may actually have it, right? And it also comes to the case where, well, how do people know what the password is? You might actually put, the sticker on a sticky note right next to the monitor, or a sticky note on the bottom of a keyboard, right? You never want to do those things, but if it's a shared account, it definitely is a risk on keeping that account secret. So use 80 accounts instead, right? Remember, you have this 80 group called ESX admins that if you were to use that account, you have to create the account. And if you use it, anybody who's in that account is an ESX admin. And then these accounts can probably manage their own passwords in a more secure fashion. Always use the vSphere client to administer your host managed by vCenter server, right? You're doing that as opposed to using any host direct access like the host client or SSH. If you have a host in lockdown mode, that's a good thing because then you don't even have to worry about those other types of tools anyway. Right? The host client should only be used when vCenter server is unavailable. And then manage the use of security services and functions. Keep your host firewall enabled, obviously. Keep SSH and the ESXi shell services disabled. And if you do have to enable them, don't forget you can set those timeouts so that you don't have to worry as much about turning the services off after you're done using them. And then lockdown mode is recommended, especially normal lockdown mode is a good practice. And then, of course, the VMware Certificate Authority, use that to provision the certificates for each and every host with those signed certificates. And that should be sufficient in how we manage our hosts. And then make sure for the client systems that need direct access to those hosts from whatever time they need them, they may need to have the ESX server certificates placed on those client systems. And then finally, for virtual machines, right? Again, we actually have a couple lessons coming up specifically on VMs, but as a general VM protection overview, We want to have you employ the same security measures for a VM as you would for pretty much any other server out there. Keep all the security measures current and patched, specifically within those guest OSs. Install antivirus, anti-malware software inside those guest OSs. Right? Consider using the software with vSphere endpoint for hypervisor level protection. Disable unnecessary functions in your VMs. You might want to even consider disabling unnecessary virtual hardware to your VMs as well. Now, when you build a VM, it should only build a VM hardware that you specify. So what you don't want to have is unnecessary ports or virtual devices. Ensure that the copy and paste operations between the guest operating systems and the remote console are disabled. They are by default, so that's good. You want to restrict users from running commands on a VM and use templates to deploy those VMs so that you have a master golden copy of the VM that's already had its security settings already applied, keeping that consistent as machines are deployed throughout your environment. And of course, keep those guest operating systems patches up to date. So that was a list of, again, just an overview of the different areas that the vSphere security guide will have you go through. We took a look at the importance of that security configuration guide, not the vSphere security guide so much here, but the actual configuration guide that actually shows the best practices on about 60 or 70 different security parameters and attributes in a vSphere environment. You should also have been able to identify the recommendations for the vCenter server security. We went through that in this lesson. The strategies for securing the vSphere management network, identify recommendations for host security, and also recognize the guidelines for general VM and guest OS protection. So that ends this lesson. We'll start up in the next lesson, taking a look at protocols and processes, standard processes and procedures. We'll take a look at that when we come back from the break. We'll see you in a few minutes.